Hey everybody, today I want to talk about the age of ideologies. I'm going to talk about liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and the revolutions of 1848. Now, we talked about how the French Revolution and Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of change and upheaval in Europe, and how the Congress of Vienna tried to, it was a time of reaction against the upheaval, so it was conservative. It didn't want all these changes to keep going. It wanted to go back to how things were before the French Revolution. Now there's actually some reactions against the Congress of Vienna. And some of these things like liberalism and socialism, they're also reactions against the Industrial Revolution. So when I talk about liberalism and socialism, they're not just reactions against the conservative Congress of Vienna. They're also intertwined with the Industrial Revolution. And you'll probably read about some of that in your chapter. Okay, so I want to talk about liberals first. Now, this liberalism is not the same as modern day liberalism. Actually, this liberalism is more closely associated with modern day conservatism. So this liberalism of the 1800s, scholars call it classical liberalism to distinguish it from modern day liberalism, which isn't the same thing. Here's just some beliefs of the old liberals or the classical liberals. Liberty and equality are great, but liberty is much more important than equality. If you grant people liberty, you'll get more equality than vice versa. They believe in representative governments. They believe in equality before the law, not equality of outcomes. So they want you to have the same rights as everybody, but not the same results. They're big on individual freedoms, such as speech, the press, assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of religion would go under here. Economic liberalism is a big part of the old classical liberalism as well. We'll talk more about that here in a second. The individual is an end in himself. You know, the individual does not exist for the state. He exists for himself. Government is a necessary evil, so you should have the least amount of government as possible. And property qualifications are probably a good thing for voting. They believe that people who have property have more of a stake in making sure society functions well. Now, that's not true of every classical liberal, but a lot of them it is. John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Adam Smith, those are famous classical liberals. I told you economic liberalism, here's what it is. It's laissez-faire economics. That's just a fancy word that basically means leave it alone. Unrestricted private enterprise and no government interference in the economy. That's one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution works so well in Great Britain or takes off so quickly. The government's not interfering with everything. So businessmen, capitalists, they can do what they need to do to get their business, off and running. If something doesn't work, they have the complete freedom to change course and try something else. Adam Smith advocated laissez-faire economics, and like I said, it's widely accepted in Britain. Now, socialism is another new kind of ideology. It comes out of France. It's a backlash against the destructive individualism of liberalism. Socialists believe society needs to be reorganized to promote cooperation and unity. Some of the socialist beliefs are that inequality is immoral. Inequality is actually the main problem in society. So when you have like the Industrial Revolution, a classical liberal would say, yeah, I recognize there's a lot of income inequality, but look at all the look at all the good stuff that the poor can buy. 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, the poor people couldn't afford common household goods. But now, with the Industrial Revolution, they can. So even though there's a bigger gap between rich and poor, the poor are still better off. Socialists would say that's not true. We need to address inequality. Socialists believed in economic planning, so they believe the government has a large role to play in governing how a society's economy works. Um, Socialists believe that competition is harmful. A classical liberal would say competition is good. It forces the producer to compete for the consumer's money. So the producers are always going to try to find ways to lower their prices. But socialists would say competition is bad. There's even a lot of socialists that say private property is immoral. They might not necessarily mean a farmer owning a small plot of land, but they would mean like capitalists owning huge factories and mansions. That kind of private property is immoral. For a socialist, government control is always the solution. The government should own farms, factories, railways, industries. Um, Count Henri de Saint-Simon, he's one of the early socialists. The key to progress is social organization. He says, people are parasites who are monarchists, the aristocrats, the lawyers, the churchmen. He says put doers or experts in charge, scientists, engineers, and industrialists to plan and guide the economy. So socialists believe in using the educated elite to basically figure out the best way to run society and let them do it. Charles Fourier was another one of these socialists. He actually experimented with agricultural communes. He wanted a socialist utopia. Somehow, mathematically, he came up with the idea that 1,620 people are the perfect number on each commune. Louis Blanc is another socialist. He wrote The Organization of Work. He said workers should agitate for universal voting rights and take control of the state. The state should own the workshops and factories, not the individual capitalists. Pierre Joseph Proudhon, he was probably one of the more radical ones. He had a book called What is Property? He argues that private property is theft. Property is just profit stolen from the worker. You can read his quote there. This gets us eventually into Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx studied philosophy, journalism, and economics. He borrowed a lot from Hegel, which I'll kind of tell you about. Hegel was a Prussian philosopher and kind of Marx's inspiration. He kind of had this interesting view on history that Marx borrows from. There's this thing called the absolute idea, and it unfolds through dialectic or conflict with opposing forces. So basically, here's how it goes. In every age, there's the main idea, the main way of thinking that kind of dominates society, and that's called the thesis. And in every generation, something challenges the thesis or the main way of thinking. That's the antithesis. And basically, those two things battle out, and whatever comes out is the synthesis. So you have the way of thinking that's ingrained in society, something challenges it, and then a new something, the synthesis comes out of that. Well, that's kind of what Karl Marx does, is he kind of takes that and twists it a little bit. The opposing forces are classes, not necessarily ideas. And Hegel believed that eventually the thesis and the antithesis would battle so many times over and over and over again that eventually like the perfect idea would come about. Karl Marx believes that with classes. The proletariat, they're the workers. The bourgeoisie, they're the middle class. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat are always doing battle. Eventually the proletariat will win. And this thing called the bourgeoisie ideological superstructure would basically disappear. Karl Marx believes that things like the family, religion, and Christianity, since we're in Europe, culture, art, literature, these are just creations of the bourgeoisie. They're not natural. And once the workers, the proletariat, win this epic class struggle, that bourgeoisie ideological superstructure will disappear. In the Communist Manifesto, he says, "Let the ruling class tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." So you can basically see, like, there's that class struggle. you have a communist revolution, and after you have the communist revolution, you have a utopia. There's no inequality. There's only one class, the proletariat. So actually, it's a classless society. So it's almost like you have it's been criticized as a religion basically because you have a set of beliefs, and it's good versus evil, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. So the proletariat are good, the bourgeoisie are evil. Good versus evil. The communist revolution is almost this like apocalyptic battle, and then you have like heaven on earth, utopia. Um, so Marx has been criticized for basically almost creating a type of religious fervor for his writings. Um, so that's a little bit about liberalism and socialism. Now here's this other belief, nationalism. Nationalism is just the belief that each people had its own genius and its own specific unity. They're kind of united by common language, history, and culture. Johann Gottfried von Herder, he's an 18th century philosopher and historian, and he was a big proponent of nationalism. He argued that each people had their own genius and culture. So if you're European, if you're African, if you're Asian or Arab or whatever, every group of people kind of have their own qualities, their own things that they're good at. And he also argued that, language, ethnicity, culture, heritage, history, geography, religion, self-consciousness, these are all the things that make a nation. A nation is not just, borders and boundaries. It's all of that other stuff. Now, you can be a liberal and a nationalist. You can be a socialist and a nationalist. You can be a conservative and a nationalist. But you can't be a liberal and a socialist. You can't be a conservative and a socialist. You can't be a liberal and a conservative. So there's nationalists in all three of those ideologies, just to kind of let you know. There's also another movement called the Romantic movement. This is also a backlash against industrialization and basically the Enlightenment. Think about the Enlightenment. It's all about the human mind, meaning reason. Like everything is rational, everything is scientific. They kind of took the romanticism out of life. And then you have the Industrial Revolution coming along, and you basically got, pollution, you've got dirty cities, you've got crowded cities, you've got dim factories where it's really bad working conditions. The Romantics are kind of revolting against those things. The Romantic movement is characterized by emotion, imagination, spontaneity. Its emphasis is off of rationality, order, and restraint. So Romantic movement kind of challenges the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The Romantic movement is probably best known for its literature, probably poetry. William Wordsworth wrote, "Spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility," kind of summing up what he thought the Romantic movement meant. So Wordsworth, Victor Hugo, the Brothers Grimm, Beethoven. So you get some music in there as well. That's just kind of an outlet people are looking for to kind of deal with kind of the rigidness of the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment. There's kind of another thing that's a little bit romantic. A lot of people get caught up in it. Greece starts to try to get their independence. Ancient Greece is really important to Western civilization. They'd kind of disappeared. The Ottomans had controlled them. The Greek people don't go away. Greek history doesn't go away. Greek culture, Greek language, those things don't go away. But on the map, you've got the Ottoman Empire ruling that area. So things like language and the Orthodox Church kind of kept the idea of Greece alive. But basically, Greece starts to push for its independence again. And a lot of Europeans are like caught up in it. They're like, this is kind of a romantic movement. Here's this young, or not young, this very old nation, very important to us as Westerners. And it's kind of like been oppressed for so long, and now it's trying to gain its freedom. So if you look at slide 30, you can see how the Ottoman Empire was up there in southern Europe, and we've kind of seen that this session. There's this Greek patriot, Alexander Ispalanti. I probably butchered his last name, but he kind of leads the Greeks and fights the Ottomans. Um, Metternich was opposed to Greek independence because he didn't want revolutions happening. And it's kind of strange. You'd think as a European, as a part of the kind of established Christian order, he would want this young Christian nation, old Christian nation, to be able to throw off the Muslim rulers, but he actually opposed Greek independence. Um, a lot of Europeans want Greek independence. So even if countries like Great Britain, France, and Russia, even if they're worried about revolution spreading from Greece to Austria, then back to France, and all over Europe, the people of Europe kind of pushed them to support Greek independence. Um, these countries tell Turkey to kind of accept, an armistice or eventually Greek independence. The Ottomans refuse, so Great Britain, France, and Russia send their navies and fight the Ottomans. The Greeks declare their independence in 1830. So the Greeks get their independence. So sometimes revolution is okay. Other places in Europe, revolution spreads. Louis XVIII, he had issued the Constitutional Charter in 1814. It's basically a liberal constitution. The gains that the French Revolution fought for are protected. Intellectual and artistic freedom is granted. There's a permanent parliament established. Remember how the Estates General was never called? That's one of the things they didn't like in the French Revolution. The monarch never allows us to meet. Well, now they're going to meet. Voting in France is still very light, about 100,000 out of 30 million. So it's not a very democratic constitution, but it's probably better than what they had. Later on, you get this guy, Charles X. He comes after Louis. He tries to revive absolutism. He repudiates the charter in July 1830. He strips many of their voting rights. He censors the press. You have this thing called the July Revolution. The government ends up collapsing after 3 days. Charles has to flee and abdicates his throne. Louis Philippe is the new ruler in France. He accepts the charter. We'll talk more about him later. Now, there's a huge amount of revolutions that happened in 1848. 1848 is kind of a moment in history where historians look back and say that was a big year for Europe. The late 1840s, they're a hard time. There's famine, there's unemployment, a lot of discontent throughout Europe. Some people still have leftover emotions from the Napoleonic Wars. We've talked about these new ideologies, liberalism, nationalism, socialism. They're putting pressure on Europe. And you get revolutions throughout Europe, but I'm going to just focus on France, Austria, Germany, and Italy. Now, Louis Philippe has been ruling for about 18 years in France. There's discontent among the French people. A lot of them can't vote. You saw that already. A lot of officials have to do the government's bidding. There have been around 70 assassination attempts against Louis during those 18 years. And in February 1848, you have revolution break out in France. So the revolutions of 1848, they start in France. Parisians begin to build barricades in the streets. They demand new government. Louis Philippe refuses to fire on the crowd. He flees to London. Remember how during the French Revolution, Napoleon talked about, or he bragged about putting a cannon in the street and, a whiff of grape shot will send those people home. Louis Philippe is not willing to kill his own people to stay in power. So I think that shows he's not necessarily an absolutist. The Second French Republic is declared. Every adult male is given the right to vote. Slavery is ended in the French colonies. The death penalty is abolished. A 10-hour workday is instituted in Paris. Louis Blanc plays a big role in this revolution in France. He establishes the national workshops. Basically, the socialists tell the whole country of France, if you want a job and you're out of work, the government will guarantee you a job. So you actually get a lot of people coming to Paris expecting work, and the government just can't create jobs to meet everyone's needs. They might create a few, but the government can't just magically make everyone's problems go away. They have elections in France. And basically, the socialists lose the election. Moderates and monarchists win. So the socialists are now in the minority, and they actually try to challenge the results of the election by kind of having another revolution. So, the socialists revolted, came into power, they have democratic elections and lose. Now they kind of have another revolution. These are known as the June days. There's about 10,000 people killed or wounded because there's a lot of fighting in Paris. The Republican Army puts down the insurrection. The socialists are defeated. France has another election in December of 1848, and Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he wins. And guess what he does in 1852? He makes himself Emperor Napoleon III. So now you've got a descendant of Napoleon on the French throne again. I got a picture of him there. So we'll kind of see later what happens with him. Other places, Austria. The revolution spreads to Austria from France. Liberals in other countries demand constitutions that are written, representative government, civil liberties. Metternich, he's still a prominent figure. Hungarian nationalists have been demanding basically their own self-government for a while. And what ends up happening is Metternich is forced to flee. So he finally gets ousted after almost 40 years in power. Ferdinand I is forced to grant concessions. And you can kind of see there's Hungary on slide 54. But what about all those other ethnic groups? If Hungary gets their own self-determination, won't everyone else in the Austrian Empire kind of clamor for it as well? Well, basically, the Austrian monarchs put a stop to this. The Archduchess Sophia, she's a Bavarian princess. She's married to Ferdinand's brother. She insists that her son, Francis Joseph, be put on the throne. This is the guy that's going to be in power when World War I breaks out. So you can see 1848 to 1905, he's still around. I got a picture of him there, a painting with some crazy hair. So basically, the Austrian monarchs crushed the revolutions. Francis Joseph was crowned emperor in December of 1848. Tsar Nicholas sends troops to help crush the Hungarians. So in 1848, the revolutions fail, but in 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is created. So basically, the Hungarians get some say in their own lives, their own government later on. Basically, what happens is Austria-Hungary is one country. It's an empire. The Austrians are the German-speaking minority, but they control the country. In matters of foreign policy, Austria gets to make all the decisions, and Hungary has to go along with it. So if you live in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have to do whatever the monarch says in foreign policy. But as far as Hungary goes, they get to have their own schools, their own police force. They get to do their own government business in their own language. So they kind of are like a country within a country. Germany is the other place, one of the other places that the revolutions take place. The main cause in Germany and Italy are nationalism. Remember, Germany and Italy are not countries, even though people living in Germany and Italy feel like they should be a country. They have the same history, culture, language, etc. Liberal-minded people want to be unified into a German state. Frederick William IV gives in and promises to grant Prussia a liberal constitution. Prussia is one of the biggest German states. They have this thing called the Frankfurt Parliament. It meets in Frankfurt and writes a constitution. They also deal with these territories, Schleswig and Holstein. There's a thing called the First Schleswig War. Don't worry about that. There's two types of basically modes of thinking in German unification. There's this thing called Kleindeutsch and Grossdeutsch. Kleindeutsch want Prussia to lead. Grossdeutsch want Austria to lead. Because remember, who should the German states unify under? Austria is the biggest German-speaking nation. So some people want Austria to kind of like create a German state. Other people want Prussia to create a German state. Eventually, the Kleindeutsch faction wins out, so Prussia will eventually create the country of Germany. The monarch says, "I will not stoop down to pick up a gutter from the crown." So they offer the monarch a constitution, but he says, "No thanks." Italy, it's also about nationalism. Italy's divided into about 4 different states. Italian nationalists want to get rid of Austrian influence. You can see on the map there on slide 68 how part of Italy is controlled by Austria. These are the 2 guys that are the main figures in the revolutions of 1848 in Italy: Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi. Mazzini and Garibaldi drive the Pope out of Italy. They declare the Republic of Rome, and their goal is to unite all of Italy. But eventually Napoleon III, who's in power in France, he sends in French troops, and they restore the Pope to power. So this isn't going to work out for the Italians. So basically, here's the results of the revolutions of 1848. Serfdom ends in Austria and Prussia. Some democratic changes come to France, but most importantly, nationalism fails in Germany and Italy. So Germany and Italy are going to have to wait about 30 years before they can become independent countries.